In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with 500 men. The empire he was about to face had 5 million people. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than any city in Europe at the time. It commanded an army of hundreds of thousands of warriors. It had never lost a war. It had been expanding for nearly a century, absorbing city after city, building the most powerful civilization in the Americas. 2 years later, it was gone. Not retreating, not weakened, gone. The city reduced to rubble, the last emperor in chains. The empire that had taken a century to build dismantled in 24 months by a force that, at its largest, never exceeded a few thousand Europeans. The standard explanation is guns and steel, superior technology, the gap between the old world and the new. But Cortés had 13 cannon and 16 horses. The Aztecs had an army of hundreds of thousands of warriors, fortified cities, a lake fortress with causeways that could be cut at any moment. If this was a battle of technology versus numbers, the math is obvious, and the math does not favor 500 men. So the easy answer is wrong. The real answer is more interesting. The real explanation has 4 parts. A theological miscalculation that paralyzed the most powerful man in the Americas. A century of enemies the Aztecs had made and never reconciled. A biological weapon that no army could fight. And the most audacious act of hostage-taking in military history. 500 men arresting an emperor inside his own palace, in the middle of his own capital, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers. But to understand why all of that was possible, you need to understand what the Aztec Empire actually was, and why, on the day Cortés arrived, it was already sitting on a powder keg. The Aztec Triple Alliance was founded in 1428. By 1519, it dominated central Mexico completely. Tribute flowed in from 400 subject cities. Gold, cotton, food, jade, cacao, and human beings for sacrifice. The empire didn't just rule its subjects. It extracted from them, constantly and without mercy. Every city it absorbed became a source of resources and victims. The empire grew richer. The subject peoples grew more resentful. At the center of it all was Tenochtitlan. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, fed by aqueducts carrying fresh water from the mountains. Its population of 200,000 people was served by floating gardens, busy markets, towering temples, and a degree of urban sophistication that left the first Spanish visitors speechless. One of Cortés's soldiers wrote that they didn't know whether what they were seeing was real or a dream. The engine of the empire was its sacrificial system. The Aztecs believed the sun required human blood to rise each morning. Without sacrifice, the world would end. Tens of thousands were sacrificed each year, most of them captured warriors from subject peoples. This was not merely religion, it was a system of political terror. Subject cities knew that if they failed to comply with Aztec demands, their people would be taken. The fear was the point. But fear has a cost. Every city forced to pay tribute. Every family that lost a member to the sacrificial stone. Every people ground down by a century of Aztec domination. They remembered. They hated. The Aztec Empire was not surrounded by loyal subjects. It was surrounded by a sea of subjugated, resentful peoples who were waiting, consciously or not, for someone to give them a reason to push back. In 1519, that someone arrived. Hernán Cortés was 34 years old, born in the Spanish region of Extremadura, educated, ambitious, and utterly without official authorization for what he was about to attempt. The governor of Cuba had given him command of an expedition to Mexico, then tried to cancel it when he realized how independently Cortés was thinking. Cortés ignored the cancellation order and sailed anyway, with 11 ships and about 500 men, to claim an empire nobody in Europe knew existed. On the Mexican coast, Cortés did something that shocked even his own soldiers. He burned the ships. All 11 of them. Destroyed on the beach while his men watched. There would be no retreat, no rescue, no going home. The message was not complicated. We win here, or we die here. It was an act of calculated madness that transformed 500 soldiers into 500 men who had no choice but to be extraordinary. His first conversations on the coast were revelatory. The Totonac people, the Sempoalans, had a message for this strange foreigner. They hated the Aztecs. They were paying tribute that bled them dry, providing sacrificial victims on demand, being humiliated and exploited. When Cortés told them he might have a solution, they listened. He had his first indigenous allies before he had fired a single shot at the Aztecs. The empire's enemies were lining up. Then he met the Tlaxcalans, an independent people who had resisted Aztec conquest for generations. The Tlaxcalans fought Cortés hard. 3 battles in which the Spanish nearly broke. But after those battles came a calculation. If this foreigner could defeat their common enemy, they wanted to be on his side. The Tlaxcalans switched from opponents to allies, and in doing so they changed the entire nature of the conquest. From this point forward, Cortés was not leading 500 Europeans into Aztec territory. He was leading a coalition of tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who wanted, above all else, to destroy the empire that had dominated them for a century. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II was receiving reports that should have triggered an immediate military response. Strange figures had appeared from the east, pale-skinned, bearded, riding enormous creatures no Aztec had ever seen. Their weapons made thunder and smoke. And the year was one reed on the Aztec calendar, the year associated with the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, who was predicted to come from the east. Moctezuma's response was not to send an army. He sent gifts: gold, feathered headdresses, ceremonial objects of tremendous sacred significance, cacao, and richly decorated clothing. He sent priests to observe. He was trying to determine whether this was a god or a threat, and in doing so, he gave Cortés something precious: time. Time to build alliances. Time to recruit enemies of the Aztecs. Time to march toward Tenochtitlan at the head of a force that grew larger with every step. Cortés marched inland with his Spanish soldiers and his tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. Moctezuma had a dozen choke points where he could have destroyed them: mountain passes, river crossings, narrow roads where numbers would have mattered. He used none of them. Instead, on November 8th, 1519, he met Cortés at the edge of the Great Causeway and invited him into the city. The most powerful ruler in the Americas escorted 500 foreign soldiers across the bridge and into his capital. It is one of the most bewildering decisions in the history of warfare. 1 week after entering Tenochtitlan, Cortés arrested Moctezuma inside his own palace. The emperor of 5 million people, taken hostage by 500 men in his own throne room, surrounded by the greatest city in the Americas. The Aztec nobles and generals were paralyzed. The person of the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, was sacred. To attack the Spanish was to risk the emperor's life, so the hundreds of thousands of Aztec warriors did nothing. Cortés had neutralized the entire military command of the empire without fighting a battle. For months, Cortés governed through Moctezuma. Then news arrived from the coast. A rival Spanish fleet of 18 ships had landed, sent by the Cuban governor to arrest him. Cortés left his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado in command of Tenochtitlan with a small garrison and marched back to the coast. He met the rival force, defeated it in a night attack, and absorbed its soldiers into his own army. He returned to Tenochtitlan stronger than when he left. But while he was gone, Alvarado had made a catastrophic decision. During the Festival of Toxcatl, one of the most important religious celebrations in the Aztec calendar, Alvarado's men had surrounded and massacred the Aztec nobility gathered in the temple precinct for the ceremony. Hundreds of unarmed lords, priests, and musicians killed in a sacred space. The reason remains debated. The result was not. Tenochtitlan erupted in fury. Moctezuma was brought to the roof of the palace to appeal for calm. The crowd pelted him with stones and arrows. Accounts disagree on whether the Spanish killed him first or whether his own people did. Either way, he died. And with him died the paralysis that had kept the Aztec army in check. The warriors of Tenochtitlan were no longer protecting an emperor. They were avenging one. La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, June 30th, 1520. Cortés attempted to withdraw his forces from Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness, slipping across the causeway in the night. The Aztecs discovered the retreat. The causeways became killing grounds. Aztec warriors in canoes attacked from both sides. Spanish soldiers fell into the water, many of them dragged down by gold they had looted and refused to abandon. Cortés lost over half his men in a single night. He reportedly sat under a tree and wept. This was the moment the Aztecs should have finished it. Cortés was broken, his army shattered, retreating toward Tlaxcala. The new emperor Cuitlahuac, who had led the counterattack and was clearly a formidable military commander, was organizing the pursuit. And then something arrived in Mexico that no army could fight: smallpox. Brought to the continent in 1520 by a slave aboard a rival Spanish ship, it entered a population that had no immunity and no understanding of what it was. The disease spread through Tenochtitlan with catastrophic speed. Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had driven the Spanish out, the man who might have finished them, died of smallpox within 80 days of taking power. Military commanders, warriors, administrators, priests, all dying. Historians estimate that the epidemic killed between a third and half of Tenochtitlan's population in the months following the Night of Sorrows. The Aztec army that had defeated Cortés was being destroyed, not by Spanish weapons, but by a pathogen that no one understood and no one could stop. Cortés regrouped with his Tlaxcalan allies, who had not wavered. He recruited more indigenous groups from across central Mexico, absorbed surviving Spanish soldiers, and had a military insight that would prove decisive. Tenochtitlan was an island. Whoever controlled Lake Texcoco controlled the city. He ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, small warships, to be built in pieces, carried over mountain passes by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters, and assembled at the lakeshore. The brigantine fleet launched in April 1521. The Aztec canoe fleet that had ruled the lake for generations was destroyed in hours. The island fortress that had never fallen was now cut off. No supplies in, no reinforcements, no escape. The siege of Tenochtitlan had begun. The new emperor Cuauhtémoc was young, perhaps 25 years old, and extraordinarily brave. He organized a defense of breathtaking determination. His warriors fought in the streets, in the canals, from the rooftops. They laid ambushes, retreated, and counterattacked, refused every offer of terms. The Spanish advanced along 3 causeways simultaneously, and every step was contested. But Cortés had a strategy that was as effective as it was brutal. He did not merely advance, he demolished. Every block taken was destroyed. Buildings pulled down, stone by stone. Rubble pushed into the canals to create solid ground for the next advance. The magnificent city that had left his soldiers breathless 2 years before was being erased. Systematically, deliberately, block by block. Inside the city, the population was dying in the streets. Smallpox continued. The food supply had been cut off for weeks. The aqueducts were severed. By late July 1521, survivors were eating leather, roots, and mud. Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. His warriors refused to surrender. The courage of the defense was extraordinary, and it could not change anything. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe with a small group of followers. A Spanish brigantine gave chase and captured him. Brought before Cortés, he reportedly pointed to a dagger at the Spaniard's belt and said, "Do it with that blade and kill me." Cortés did not. He had Cuauhtémoc tortured to find hidden gold, kept him as a prisoner for years, then had him executed on a later expedition. The empire was over. Here is the history that tends to get left out. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not fought by 500 Spaniards. Spanish accounts estimate that Cortés commanded between 80 and 100,000 indigenous warriors in the final assault. Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, Totonacs, warriors from across central Mexico who had their own reasons, deep, personal, generational reasons, to want Tenochtitlan destroyed. Why did all these peoples join? Because the Aztec Empire had spent a century making enemies. Every tribute demand remembered. Every sacrificial victim taken. Every act of Aztec domination recorded in the collective memory of every subject people. When Cortés arrived, he did not recruit reluctant allies. He found people who were already furious and gave them a viable military coalition to join. The empire's greatest weapon, fear, had produced its greatest weakness. And then there was disease. The 1520 smallpox epidemic was not the last. Wave after wave of Old World pathogens followed over the next century. Disease historians estimate that the indigenous population of central Mexico fell by as much as 90% in the 100 years after contact. The Aztec Empire fell in 1521. But the civilization that had existed there essentially ended over the following generations, through epidemic after epidemic that no political decision could stop. What was lost is almost impossible to fully account for. The city of Tenochtitlan, demolished and built over, Its stones used for the cathedral and government buildings of Mexico City, which stands on top of it today. Most of the Aztec codices, the books recording their history, astronomy, religion, and law, burned by Spanish priests. An astronomical calendar of extraordinary precision. Agricultural systems, medical knowledge, architectural traditions, a civilization's accumulated learning gone in a generation. What survived is also remarkable. The Nahuatl language, still spoken by over 1 million people. The food, chocolate, tomatoes, maize, chili peppers, vanilla. The sacred sites. And the identity. Mexico's national symbol is the Aztec eagle on a cactus, the emblem of the very empire that was destroyed. A conquered civilization at the heart of a modern nation. The real lesson of what happened between 1519 and 1521 is not about technology. It is about the kind of power the Aztec Empire had built. They built it on fear, on tribute extracted by threat, on sacrifice enforced by terror, on domination maintained by the constant demonstration of what happened to those who resisted. And fear, as a foundation for power, has a specific vulnerability. The moment someone demonstrates that the source of the fear can be challenged, all the suppressed resentment underneath comes flooding out at once. Cortés was not stronger than the Aztecs. He was the match that lit fuel that had been accumulating for 100 years. Moctezuma's hesitation, the gifts, the invitation, the failure to destroy the Spanish at a dozen points where he could have, is often explained by the Quetzalcoatl theory. But there may be a simpler explanation. Moctezuma had ruled through fear for 17 years. He had never faced a situation where the fear stopped working. When Cortés arrived and the fear did not stop him, Moctezuma had no contingency. He had no experience of a world where the threat did not produce compliance. He had optimized his entire reign for an instrument that, in this moment, failed him completely. In 1519, the Aztec Empire was the most powerful civilization in the Americas. By 1521, it was gone. Not because 500 men were stronger than 5 million. Because an empire built entirely on the compliance of terrified subjects is not really an empire at all. It is a hostage situation. And when the hostages find someone willing to help them fight back, when the fear breaks even for a moment, the whole structure collapses. The Aztecs did not lose to Hernán Cortés. They lost to every enemy they had ever made. And over 100 years of conquest, they had made quite a few.